clear for launch. And with that, shut down your visors, O2 on, and prepare for ignition, 202. Copy that, and
Okay, I'm Mr. Rushoff and we're back. In the first part of our lesson on how Europe's history has influenced its culture, we have just finished talking about how the Black Death had swept across Europe in the 1300s. In this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to see how this Black Death set into motion a great deal of change on the continent. But first, we're going to go back to before the Black Death and look at a major point of cultural divergence. Now, remember when we talked about how Diocletian divided the Roman Empire into two parts? We have the Western Roman Empire and we have the Byzantine Empire. Well, one of the effects that this had was the first major division of the Christian church. Now, because the split of the empire meant that both Rome and Constantinople each would be capitals, how Christianity would be practiced would be split between the practices of each of these two cities. And in 1054, this divide between these churches, the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox churches, became official during something known as the Great Schism. Now, during this divide, the Pope and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople literally threw each other out of the Christian church, not agreeing with how the other actually did their practices of their religion. Now, there certainly are differences in how Orthodox and Catholics practice their faith. Among these is, in Rome, Catholic churches followed the leadership of the Pope and they used Latin as the church's official language. In Constantinople, the Orthodox Church had adopted different practices such as establishing local control. There is no Pope-type figure, and they used local languages of the people instead of Latin. By the time of the Great Schism, Orthodox Christianity had fully become the religion of the Byzantine Empire, just as Roman Catholicism had become the religion of the Western Roman Empire. Now, at the time of the bubonic plague, Rome had already been toppled by the Germanic tribes like the Vandals nearly 900 years before. Now, while it still stood, the Byzantine Empire had already seen its influence weakened with the growth of the Muslim Ottoman Empire. The Black Death further weakened the Byzantines. During the plague, 50% of the people of Constantinople would be killed. With Constantinople further weakened, in 1453, the Muslim Ottomans captured Constantinople and renamed the city to its current name, Istanbul. Now, the Ottomans would spread Islam into Eastern Europe and stayed in power until World War I. But not only did the Black Death mean the change for the Byzantine Empire, it helped create a rebirth of culture and science throughout Europe. It set the condition for the Renaissance. The Renaissance began in 1350 in Italian city-states such as Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Milan. The Renaissance means a rebirth. This is fitting as arts and sciences were revived during this period. During this time, it was common for rich families to pay talented artists such as Michelangelo and Da Vinci to create works of art in order to show off their wealth. But the church also commissioned these artist talents such as Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel as seen in this photograph I took. Now, one of the most spectacular achievements of the Renaissance was the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. Taking over 100 years to construct, it is a phenomenal illustration of the artistic achievements of the period. Its designers were a who's who of Italian artists such as Bramante, Michelangelo, Barderno, and Bernini. With its dome reaching 448 feet, today the St. Peter's Basilica is still the tallest dome in the world. It was also very costly to build. To pay for the construction of the basilica, the Pope called for all of Catholic Christendom to assist in paying for the structure. And one of the ways that some of these dioceses did this was by selling indulgences. In the Catholic Church, indulgences are a way to reduce the amount of punishment one has to undergo for their sins. This usually means doing good things and praying. Now, while disputed by some, Pope Leo X offered indulgences to those who gave money to build St. Peter's Basilica. Essentially, this was paying to be able to get to heaven. Now, whether the Pope authorized the practice of selling indulgences or not, it is certain that dioceses such as the one in Wittenberg, Germany, were doing just this. Now, this didn't sit very well for a Catholic priest by the name of Martin Luther. In 1517, he wrote a thesis of 95 things that he believed that the church needed to change in order to be more in line with the scripture. After writing this, he took his 95 thesis and he nailed it to the church door. Now, nailing things to the church door really wasn't a problem. After all, it was a common practice at the time. Think of it as kind of like a 1517 equivalent of Facebook or Twitter. What was the issue was that Luther was directly challenging the authority of the Pope in the church. Obviously, the Pope was not amused and excommunicated Luther from the Catholic Church. It's important to note that Martin Luther was not the first to call into question some of the Catholic Church's actions. A century before, a Czech priest by the name of John Hus had voiced his challenges to the Church, many being exactly the same thing that Luther had brought up. As a result, the Church arrested and then burned Hus at the stake for heresy. Now, Luther didn't suffer such a fate. Instead, he changed the face of Christianity and ushered in a second of the two major divisions of the Church in what is now known as the Protestant Reformation. The difference between Hus and Luther was Johannes Gutenberg and the printing press. While the Koreans had first invented movable type printing presses, Gutenberg introduced the concept to Western Europe in around 1440. By the time Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the church door, printing presses had already printed millions of books within Europe. This meant that within 2 years, 300,000 copies of Luther's 95 Theses had been copied and distributed around Europe. And while the church had been able to quiet Hus, they were unable to stop Luther's words from reaching the people, and the church once again saw a split between Catholicism, Orthodox, and now Protestant Christianity. Today we can see these three divisions of Christianity geographically in Europe, with Protestant religions up in the north, including the area where Wittenberg, Germany is. Catholicism is dominant in most of southern and western Europe, and Orthodox Christianity is still dominant in the east. The Protestant Reformation coincided with a series of significant events in Europe. These were the ages of exploration and empires and the industrial and political revolutions within Europe and across the globe. The development of science in the Renaissance provided new navigational technology that encouraged ocean exploration. This was important because since the Ottomans' capture of Constantinople, Europeans no longer had a convenient land route to be able to trade for goods in Asia. Europe needed a way to get to Asia by sail. This led to Columbus, who in 1492 discovered the New World in an attempt to go to India. Now, this also led to Spain and Portugal to explore Latin America, and then England and France to survey North America. Not all European countries were able to take advantage of this. Germany was unable to access the Atlantic because of British blockades, and Italy felt quite content to just focus within the trade in Mediterranean. These discoveries led European nations to the next step, which was to take control of the lands they had discovered to be able to gain resources from those territories. Spain took most of Central and South America and the Philippines. France claimed parts of North America, Vietnam, and Africa. And Britain claimed North America, the Caribbean, Australia, India, Hong Kong, and many other places. In fact, so expansive was the British Empire that it is said that the sun never sat on it. In one of the most significant changes in human development, in 1760 England, the Industrial Revolution began. This was driven by the developments of the production of steel from coal and iron, and then the development and use of machinery created through steel and oil. Once countries discovered that technology could also build wealth, it fed the drive to develop even more technology. This also had an effect upon colonization, as manufacturing and weapons led to nations taking more colonies. An example of this was the 1885 Conference of Berlin, in which European countries met to divide Africa amongst themselves. Now, the Industrial Revolution had two major impacts. First, instead of having a majority of the products made in cottage industries, things started being made in factories. This increased the ability of products while decreasing costs. The second effect is that with the Industrial Revolution, we saw the first large-scale movement towards urbanization as more people started moving out of the countries into the cities to work in factories. Now, the revolutions during this period were not only industrial, they were also political, as European colonies rebelled against their European masters. In 1776, we saw the American Revolution, and while the nature of the revolution was different, in 1789, the French rebelled against King Louis VI, which ended up with Louis losing his head, and we saw the rise of Napoleon. And we've also discussed earlier in our Latin America unit how Central and South America gained its independence from Spain and Portugal under the leadership of Simón Bolívar. Now, the story of Europe's modern history continues to be one of conflict. In the 1800s and 1900s, fear of other cultures led to the rise of nationalism. Now, this is the belief that people should be loyal to their own nationalities, but it also led to fierce rivalries between these different nations. When countries formed alliances with other similar cultures, they gained common enemies, and war became the embodiment of the phrase, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." Now, these alliances that were built upon nationalism set the conditions so that the simple assassination of a prince led to a worldwide war. See, in 1914, an anarchist assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And when Austria blamed Serbia for the death of their prince, most of the European countries started to take sides. This led to Germany going through Belgium in 1914 to invade France. This invasion put the continent into all-out warfare between what is known as the Central Powers. This included Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, among others, against the allies of Serbia, Russia, France, Germany, Italy, and joining in the fun of the last year was the United States. In the end, it was the Allies that would win in 1918. Now, for punishment for losing the war, all the Central Powers lost land. Poland was created as a buffer zone between Germany and France. And since Germany threw the first punch, Germany was the biggest loser, losing a region called Alsace to France, along with being forced to pay heavy payments to the winning countries that they ultimately could not pay. The war also meant the end of the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian empires, which were broken into separate ethnically pure countries, except for Yugoslavia, which still continued to be a mesh of multiple ethnicities on the Balkan Peninsula. Now, by 1917, another movement was underway, communism. Inspired by the German Karl Marx and the Englishman Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin led a revolution in Russia to overthrow the Tsar of Russia. This led to the creation of the Communist Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union. The combination of recovering from World War I and the global Great Depression led many Italians and Germans to become very unhappy with their governments. Their people gravitated to two charismatic but radical leaders, which were Hitler, who created the National Socialist Party, which we now know as the Nazis, and Mussolini, who led the Italian fascist state. Now, despite prohibitions against building a navy and an army, Hitler did so anyway, and in 1939, Germany invaded Poland to be able to regain some of the land it had lost during World War I. And when the Allies did nothing, Hitler was emboldened and invaded France, once again, moving right through Belgium. Now, joining Germany was Italy, Austria, and Hungary, among others, making up the Axis powers. The Allies this time was Britain, France, and the United States, and when Germany invaded them, the Soviet Union joined the Allies. Now, after 6 years of war, the Allies would once again win despite tragic losses. But one of the most tragic events of World War II was the killing of millions of Jews, gypsies, mentally disabled, and political enemies. Over 6 million Jews alone were killed in what was known as the Holocaust. This was the systemic policy of the Nazis to exterminate the Jews. And 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population was killed during this time. Even before the end of the war, despite being allies, the West and the Soviets were maneuvering against each other in what would be called the Cold War that lasted until 1991. At the end of World War II, instead of returning their captured territories, the Soviet Union kept control of their occupied land, including the eastern portion of Germany, and they split the country's capital of Berlin. Western Berlin was held by France, England, and the United States, and the eastern half of the city was controlled by the Soviet Union. When too many East Berliners were fleeing to West Berlin in order to gain freedom, the Soviet Union and the East government raised the Berlin Wall in order to keep East Berliners within the city. Now, for 50 years, the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe with a command economy and enforced atheism, as religion was seen as a threat to the communist ideals that was put forward by the Soviet Union. The human cost of Soviet communism was extraordinary, especially under the rule of Joseph Stalin, who took over after Vladimir Lenin died. Beyond heavy pollution and poor development, in the 29 years of Stalin's rule, it is estimated that more than 20 million of his own people were killed through forced starvations, purges, and executions. Some actually put this number as high as 50 million people killed. Now, the Soviet Union's communist economy proved to be unsustainable, as it could not keep up with the United States military advancements such as Star Wars. And no, we're not talking about the movie. Star Wars was an initiative by President Reagan to provide a shield to prevent Soviet missiles from raining down on the United States. Now, the Soviet leader Gorbachev knew that he couldn't keep up with the Americans, and he also realized that his economy was about ready to start crashing down around him. Therefore, he opened up a series of talks with President Reagan. He also instituted two important policies in an attempt to change how the Soviet Union did things in their country. These were glasnost and perestroika, which meant openness and reform. In the end, it was too little too late, and the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991. In the 1990s, the tensions caused by the mix of ethnicities that had coexisted on the Balkan Peninsula since the Byzantine Empire would become violent. After the fall of communism, Yugoslavia fractured into 6 mostly ethnically pure countries. These ethnic countries started to turn to each other and started to cleanse the areas of outsiders. The worst cases were in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, where over 110,000 people were killed. Despite a deal brokered by President Clinton in 1991, the region still experiences ethnic tensions. All right, so we've looked at the history of Europe. Now you should be able to describe how the geography of Europe has impacted its history and how its history has impacted the culture of Europe. All right, keep on learning.